Oh, well, hello, folks. How is everyone? My name is William the Bastard, and I would like to welcome you back to episode 4 of Defining the Occult. Why was Wicca considered different from the ancient pagan customs and traditions? Well, one of the main reasons is many of those have been lost through the burning and removal of entire libraries during the times of persecution. For the most part, these traditions were oral, and that's another reason they didn't get wrote down, as a lot of people in Europe, especially shamanic customs and traditions, going by various names, for lack of a better word, ancient witchcraft. They just simply were not a literary culture per se, like ancient Greece or Egypt. So a lot of those traditions, the ones that did get wrote down, being burned as heretical. Furthermore, there were inconsistencies with what was known by these ancient pagans and what was practiced in the circles of Wicca. By no means were the ancient practitioners of shamanic arts in Europe altruistic. They performed curses, and it is well documented that they have. The diabolicism was definitely there. Therefore, so much of the ancient revelry and the true fleshly delights of those initial celebrations were completely lost, not even being recorded in many cases in history. The best clues we have to them are some of the surviving folk traditions from the descendants of people like the Picts. Another example would be to look to the traditions of the Sami, which were pre-Celtic people that are even still actively shamanic today in the far northern regions of Scandinavia and parts of eastern Russia. Another place that one should look to find evidence of the purest and truest remnants of those ancient pagan times would be in the musical and poetic traditions of Ireland and Scotland and bardism abroad. The skalds of the North, Scandinavia, and Iceland, the minstrels. Some of these ancient poetic rhyme spellers could even put a man to death by their mere insults, interwoven into words. After the onset of the 1950s, many books and manuals became available upon the subject of witchcraft, not only Gerald Gardner's, but a series of other writers, affiliates and non-affiliates of him, all producing various manuals on so-called witchcraft. However, not all of these manuals fit into the criteria of what is labeled as Wicca. Part of the reason for this explosion in literature on the subject of witchcraft and Wicca and the expansion of it was due to the repeal of the last witchcraft laws on the books in England in the early 1950s. This made witchcraft legal to openly practice and declare in public. And the point of view of the law, witchcraft simply did not exist. And this had been the case in many courts, both in colonial times and times of the state's expansion, and of course in Europe. See, Wicca, one of its greatest appeals was its shunning of diabolicism in general. Gerald Gardner and some of his teaching uh, would insist upon a divorcing of diabolicism, getting back to their pagan roots. This meant a shunning of the devil and the devil's history and attachment to witchcraft in that history, reclaiming their initial pagan heritage as much as possible. The reason for this is they didn't want to return to the Inquisition times, and many of them were very altruistic in their thinking and just simply didn't want to hurt others. And they had things such as the Wiccan Rede, including the Law of Three, which states basically if you cast a negative spell toward another individual or situation, it will return to you threefold. Some even say more, but it's variable. And I guess that what's a sin to one man is not to another. Other occult philosophies have a different take on it. Even though Wicca borrowed from esoterica a complete shunning of its darker aspects, it tried to maintain the earliest traditions, Gardnerian Wicca and others, more folkish underlying ties and traditions. No doubt it was that this made Wicca a far more appealing route to take for middle-class Protestant and Catholic youth of the United Kingdom and the United States. This made it more appealing, this divorcing, this lack of the devil. Harm ye none, do what ye will. These concepts were not new in the occult by any means. They had originally started as early as the Druidic reformations. Druidic in the sense that they no longer committed to sacrifices of pre-Christian times, were not observed, but some of their more wiser aspects, their poetry, their learning, their ability to reason, law. Druids were known for their universities as well. And so they would take on those aspects, and this would also be prevalent later on in such magical orders as the Golden Dawn and the Order of the Silver Star, others, etc., etc. All in all, hand in hand, these esoteric and Wiccan off branches would lead into what we now call the New Age movement. People that communicate with plants and stones, the so-called tree huggers. As the New Age movement progressed, things seemed to go a little bit more commercial. This was the times of psychic fairs, orreries, special gift shops that would market to popular consumer culture to sell their goods. And there was a lot of scamming done. This was also the era of 1-900 numbers and Mrs. Cleo's and all the psychics, the TV psychics that were eventually a lot of these were sued. There was a lot of scamming going on during this times, no doubt. And for the most part, a lot of the New Age hoopla, at least 65 to 80% of it, is just pure garbage and has no redeeming value that the pursuant cannot figure out on their own. Those that are seeking occult knowledge, in many cases, would do far better to employ their own interest and research themselves, rather than rely on the New Age manuals that were very repetitive at times. This was also true in the field of Wicca at some point, until certain things begin to change, and people had to come from a new approach. But by and large, a lot of the material for research in the New Age community was redundant, and a lot of it was making a big deal over things that really weren't such a big deal. Another thing that arose out of this was the paranormal research movement and the ghost hunting movements. And you can safely say that they have their foundations in the rise of the New Age Definitely so. It was also a revitalization point for silly business such as the Ouija board and seances and various low-budget evocations, as some people would call them, very unskilled evocations and little rituals that would summon demons or spirits or whatever. All this was coming back. People were really getting off on reading auras. The crystal movement, the stone movement was getting popular. Some of these movements really took hold, others didn't. Others kind of fizzed out commercially, and of course, you know, it's very limited what is useful in these fields, because you could throw 65 to 75% of it away as garbage. So what about American culture and how the occult would take off over here in the far west, in particular here in the United States? Well, as a matter of fact, there would be certain traditions that would develop out of a mixture of not only European, but African, Native American, and yes, it would take off as its own independent movement. So how far would the roots of this underlying folk culture that was behind the country folk of the Europeans persist? How deep would these folkish roots actually run? Would they follow them through generation to generation? Well, as we are about to see, it would appear so. Here in the Americas, carried over from Europe, were surviving folk traditions involving herbalism and medicine, traditional practices of witchcraft. For these people were a new type of folk magician. These practices may be the purest form of carryover from the ages of ancient pagan times. These folkish practices may very well be the last surviving remnant of pagan cultural Europe. It has been called various things, even though it does not have a title per se. Ozark witchcraft, Appalachian magic, folk medicine. But here in America, these traditions have somehow survived past all 2,000 years. These can be considered earth magics and not a designated or literary occult tradition. Much like in certain countries in Europe, these practices have nonetheless survived. The reason for this is it's very hard to culturally cleanse the roots of a culture from itself. For example, look at what all the Semitic peoples have been through. Trials, executions, attempted genocides. And yet, even though for years they did not have their own homeland, they nonetheless remained a culture. Not everybody was thrilled and happy when the first writings and books on witchcraft became mainstream. As a matter of fact, some traditional old-style covens were downright pissed off about it, angry that the long-held, guarded secrets of witchcraft were now available to the general public. Also, there was a certain rivalry between people who practiced witchcraft that leaned toward more diabolical natures of the occult and those of the New Age movement.